So Bill Feehan was a new captain in a firehouse in Harlem. And the first day he shows up as a newly minted captain, he walks in and there's these salty old dog firefighters that he's going to lead sitting around the table in the firehouse completely naked.
That was Brian McDonald, author of 5 Floors Up, the heroic family story of 4 generations in the New York Fire Department. And I'm Martin Nutty.
And I'm John Lee. Welcome to our latest Global Irish Nation conversation here on Irish Stew. Today's episode of Irish Stew is sponsored by Ogham Art, where you can find original prints, jewelry, home decor, and custom gifts featuring Ogham, the first written form of the Irish language. Visit oghamart.com, and that's OGHAMART.com, and listeners can save 20% at oghamart.com using coupon code IRISHSTEW. That's OGHAMART.com.
Hey everybody, this is Martin Nutty with the Irish Stew podcast, and I'm joined in our virtual studio by John Lee. John, what's going on, man?
Hey, Martin, good to be back on the stew. We took a bit of a hiatus, but now we're back in a big way. And we record this episode today on the morning of September 11th, 9/11, very solemn day, particularly here in New York. It's not a time that I personally like to think about very much, but we're going to think about it today as we have a Global Irish conversation with Brian McDonald, author of the just published 5 Floors Up. It's a true story of an Irish-American family who fought fires across 4 generations for the people of New York. It's a story that turns tragic on 9/11, and we'll find more about that as we talk to Brian, who's trained as a journalist. He's written many other books that we'll touch on briefly, but we'll spend most of our time, I think, with 5 Floors Up. And with that, Brian, welcome to Irish Stew.
It's great to be here. Thank you very much for having me.
Good to be here. And you had a chance to meet Martin before we went on, and we'll give the floor over to Martin in a second. But I just want to open it up with a question. You're the second Bronx-born writer we've had on that I'm aware of, and the first was Peter Quinn. And it's funny that you both sort of touch on some common ground here and there in your book and the book we talked to Peter about. But the first time I encountered Peter was at a fire department FDNY event, and he was speaking, and he spoke about how even though the fire department was no longer predominantly Irish-American, an Irish ethos lived on in the fire department, an ethos of service and sacrifice. Do you feel that even to this day, there's kind of an Irish gene in the DNA of the FDNY?
I believe so. I think it's maybe lessening a bit over the course of the years, but I still believe that it's in it's as much as part of the FDNY as the patch they wear on their shoulders. I can't claim the Bronx as it's my birthplace, but I didn't grow up in the Bronx. I grew up in a town called Pearl River, New York, and Pearl River, New York in Rockland County is, it's not unusual to hear an Irish brogue walking down the street in Pearl River. There were more cops, New York City cops and firefighters probably than any other profession there. They were commuting into the city. My father was a New York City cop. He was also the first president of the Rockland County Ancient Order of Hibernians and was the founder of the St. Patrick's Day Parade in Pearl River, which is the second biggest St. Patrick's Day Parade in New York State. I think it's one of the biggest in the country, if I'm not mistaken. So just to clear that up about my lineage. But yeah, I mean, my research, going way back in early 1900s, I believe there was a count done, and it was 75% of the firefighters were Irish American. Most of the higher echelon was Irish American. And as the years went on, maybe it lessened down, but you look at the roster of firefighters that died on 9/11, and it's predominantly Irish names. It really is, And I was Brian Davin, who's one of the characters in the book, for lack of a better word. I had a reading the other day, and he was there, and I brought him up to talk about it. And he was saying that the inordinate amount of younger people, the sons and daughters of firefighters who died in 9/11 became firefighters. So I think there was a boost up, and now it's 20 years later, and I think that echelon of firefighters, there's still a great representation of Irish Americans. There's a long-winded answer, but yeah,
No.
I think it lives on, the legacy, the Irish legacy in the FDNY.
So, Brian, speaking of Irish things, so since we've cleared up a little bit about your mysterious, questionable Bronx origins, talk to me a little bit about your Irish American identity. How important is that as a facet of your life, of your work?
Yeah, my dear sainted mother, who lit so many candles for me, you could see them from space. She is Irish, although not born in Ireland. Her parents were born in the first generation, and she held the Irish culture, the Irish tradition, as dear as you can, and she pounded it into her sons. There's four of us. I had my oldest brother passed away, but I have two other brothers, and it was always a big part of our lives. And my dad, like I said, was involved in the AOH up there. It was we were surrounded by Irish American cops and Irish American firefighters. There was a guy that lived across the street from my brother, also lived in Pearl River, and his name was Jack Ryan. And there were so many Jack Ryans in the fire department at the time, they had to number them. And he lived across from Jack Ryan number 7. And that's the truth. So yeah, it's a big part of my family and my life.
I understand, like our prior guest, Peter Quinn, you too are a product of a Jesuit university education, specifically Fordham. So what is it that turned you towards writing? Was it Fordham? Was it the Irish in you? Was it the Jesuits? Who's to blame?
So at the time, and I think we'll talk about this a little bit later because I wrote a book about it, but I was working in a restaurant called Elaine's, and Elaine's was a very famous literary hangout in New York City, and I was surrounded by writers. Now, that's not the reason. I joked that one day I looked over the bar and the semi-famous writer was passed out in his veal parmesan, and I thought to myself, well, maybe I could be a writer too. But that wasn't the reason that I became a writer. I had been, let's say, I had a misspent youth that lasted into my 20s. And when I got to Elaine's, I had no college credits at all, nothing. And I was about 5 years into Elaine's, and Elaine, who is an incredible New York character, Elaine Kaufman, huge woman, didn't take guff from anybody, told you where to go at the drop of a hat. She said to me, "What are you fooling around for? Go back to school." And it was as simple as that. So I went to Fordham, and although it is a Jesuit university, I went to the Lincoln Center campus, which is a lot less, even though it's under the auspices of Fordham, it was a lot less Jesuit. There was a lot of lay teachers, and I think there was only, they had mass there every Sunday, every day of the week, but it was still there wasn't a big emphasis on it, so I can't take that. But I started taking writing courses, and I wrote for the school newspaper. And my first piece was the first person piece that ran in the Fordham Observer, and I was over the moon. I saw my byline, and I was hooked. I was absolutely hooked. That's what I wanted to do.
You mentioned, obviously, you talked a little bit about your father in the beginning of your writing career, and as I understand it, your first book was, I believe, called My Father's Gun. Which is, again, a somewhat similar approach to your current book in the sense that it tracked multiple Irish generations, but in this particular case, the police department. So you talk a little bit about, the shadow of the police department that casts over your life, and was that difficult growing up under that?
The title of the book, My Father's Gun, and I wrote the proposal. I went to, after I got my undergrad at Fordham, I was accepted into Columbia Journalism School, University of Columbia Graduate School of Journalism. And I took a course there that the whole thrust of the course was to write a book proposal. It was called a book writing seminar. It's the professor of the course is Sam Friedman, who's legendary up there. I mean, more than 100, maybe 200 books have come out of that course, published books. He's an amazing, amazing guy. So I wrote the proposal in Columbia, and lo and behold, the proposal sold and got me out of. So I was able to leave bartending, but that's a whole nother story. But the title of the book, My Father's Gun, comes from an image that I had when I was growing up. I was about 8 years old, and my father used to come home from work, and it was a ritual, and I'd watch him every time he'd come home. He'd pull in the driveway, he'd come out. He was a squad commander of the 41st Precinct, so he wore a suit. He'd come in and take off his suit jacket and hang his suit jacket around his belt. Hanging from his belt would be the police special, and he'd take his belt off and take the holster off the belt and put the gun up. He kept the bullets separate. The gun was never loaded in the closet, but I was transfixed by that gun, And, of course, the warning was you never touch the gun, you're going to get it. Although my dad wasn't very much of a disciplinarian, but he made it clear that we had to stay away from it. But one time my parents were out and I couldn't help myself. I went up to the closet and I took the gun out. It was one of those little police specials, it's a 5-shooter. It looks, compared to the Glocks and everything they carry today, it looked like a toy. But I remember picking it up and it was so heavy. I remember the heft of it. And I looked at myself in the mirror, I pointed it in the mirror and I played. But somehow I knew the gun separated us from normal people. I knew that the police culture was somehow wrapped around that gun, and that was emblematic of the culture. And, when my brother went on, my brother was, about 10 years older than me. When he went on in police department, he'd get off of work and stop at the house at my parents' house, and him and my dad would talk about my dad was retired by then, but he'd give Frankie, some advice and how to handle things. And Frankie would tell, one thing about cops and firefighters too, Irish American cops and firefighters, for the most part, they were incredible storytellers. And my brother was one of them. And he'd tell tales of being on the beat and what was happening. And he was a cop in the Bronx and then a detective in the Bronx. So yeah, I was imbued by that culture. And, I took the test myself in the mid 70s, but the city was broke and they threw the test out. They were firing cops, not hiring cops. And, I just let it go by and went down a completely different path.
Yeah, I'm really interested to hear how you got, you were kind of a late college student. It seems like you got into it late, that you might have had a maturity edge at that point over some of the other students who were sort of feeling their way at that point. You've been through some life. I mean, you always hear like this, a writer should experience life. I can't imagine what you experienced behind the ar at Elaine's.
Yeah, I certainly did. It was, and I had been working the bars. I mean, here's the truth. When I was 26, I had gotten to a place in my life from partying, let's say, drinking and other activities that I couldn't go on anymore and doing, and I needed to get some help, and I got some help. And when I got to Elaine's, I was sober. I hadn't drank in about 5 years, so I was sober the whole time behind the bar at Elaine's, and it was gave me a sharpened eye. First of all, I understood how boring drinking is. It's the same stories, the same jokes, the same stupid things every night. But it also allowed me to be aware of everything that was going on. I also started to read the people that came in. I mean, on any given night at Elaine's, you'd have Norman Mailer, Kurt Vonnegut, Joan Didion. I mean, I'm not kidding. And they were regular customers, Hunter Thompson, and on and on. And then the whole other strata was the ink-stained wretches, the tabloid reporters and the New York Times reporters. And, so it was like I was surrounded by all of these.
Jimmy Breslin.
Breslin didn't come, but Pete Hamill did. Pete Hamill was
Pete Hamill. Yeah.
Yep. I worked Pete Hamill's wedding, second marriage, I guess, in Elaine's. So so it was incredible. It was incredible, and to be aware, like I said, to be cognizant of what was going on around me. It was quite an education, as much of an education than I got at Fordham, I think, maybe about even.
Besides the writers, what other kind of, just for people outside of the city who maybe never heard of Elaine, so like what other kind of celebrities would hang out there? What sort of, is there a couple of notorious incidents that stick out in your mind?
Yeah, well, we, because of writers, and a lot of these writers became screenwriters, so natural following would be the actors and producers. Woody Allen was a regular customer. Robert Altman was a regular customer. A lot of filmmakers, incredible amount of actors, and then people like Mick Jagger. The bartender who worked with me, Tommy Carney, just died last week in Florida, and they had an obit in the New York Times yesterday. I think it ran a bartender in a restaurant that's been closed for 10 years has an obit in the New York Times. It gives you some idea of what. But one night Tommy was there, and Tommy grew up in Liverpool, and he's an Irish Liverpool, about the same time the Beatles did. And one night Ringo Starr walked in, and Tommy looked over and said, "Hey, Scouser." Scouse is English stew, a low-rent stew, but it's also what Liverpudlians call each other. And Ringo Starr's neck snapped around, and he came right over to the bar, and him and Tommy had this whole great conversation about the old days in Liverpool. So there were moments like that were just, they didn't happen every night, but they happened with regularity there that were incredible.
I got one other question about Elaine's. Why? Why did that happen at that place?
So I wrote a book called Last Call at Elaine's, and it was about my time there. It was kind of, getting sober and screwing up and starting to become a writer. So I went back and I asked Elaine, I asked some of the old customers about what happened. And the story was that Elaine was in the village. She was a waitress in the village, and she worked in a place that a couple of writers used to come in. Terry Southern, you remember Terry Southern, screenwriter and book writer. He used to come in, and then Elaine saved up a bunch of money, and she opened on 88th Street and 2nd Avenue. Now, in 1962, for the non-New Yorkers, that was an outpost. That was like the end of the world. And she got a cheap store and opened up with a partner. And it was late 62. And in 63, in January 64, 2 months after John F. Kennedy was assassinated, she had a buzzer system on the door to let in, because it was a bad neighborhood then, to let in people. So the bartender called over to her. It was about 2:00 in the morning and said, "Elaine, Mrs. Kennedy's outside. You want me to buzz her in?" And she says, "Yeah, buzz her in." So in comes Jackie Kennedy. I think she was there with George Plimpton. Oh God, I used to know the people. It's escaping me. Adolph Green and his wife. There were, a bunch of. They were all at somebody's apartment. But Elaine thinks it was the first time that Mrs. Kennedy was out after the assassination of her husband. So somehow that little item found its way into Dorothy Kilgallen's column. And John, you would know that's, going back to the old days of columnists in New York. Right. And the next thing you know, it exploded. It just exploded. And the first wave was the writers. And Elaine was the type of personality that made you want to come back, because she didn't care who you were. She wasn't overwhelmed by celebrity or anything. She told me once, the only person, who was it that, Marlon Brando was the only person that wowed her, that came in. But other than that, all she wanted you to do was buy dinner. You bought dinner, you're okay. If you didn't buy dinner, you were a bum. Get the hell out. And that's what she was. So it became, and it had an amazing run. For many, many years, it was the hottest restaurant in New York.
Brian, you spoke about screenwriters and movie makers and obviously actors with Marlon Brando. And I understand your first book was made into a film. And I believe Last Call at Elaine's has been optioned, but I'm not sure if that's ever come to fruition. But I'm curious, as a writer, your take on that whole process of moving from print to video and how it feels to let go of a beloved baby that you have cultivated.
So the first book, My Father's Gun, was picked up by the History Channel, and it was filmed as a kind of a documentary. So they really didn't let go of it. They used a lot of my writing in the narration of it, and I narrated the film. So there wasn't that experience of letting go. It was a full-length 2-hour documentary. It was an amazing undertaking, and the film did okay. It got pretty good reviews. I think it won some kind of award. I'm not sure though. The second book, Last Call at Elaine's, it has not gone to fruition. It was picked up. There's a customer at Elaine's named Giancarlo Uzzielli, and Giancarlo Uzzielli is a character. I could fill up 2 podcasts about this guy. He was married to Ann Ford at one time, and one day he was such a cut up and a cad. One day he shows up at the Park Avenue apartment they lived in, and the doorman told him, "You don't live here anymore." That's how he found out that he was no longer married to Ann Ford. So his son Al, who is a descendant of Henry Ford, he's like the great grandson, or one of the 100. But he's in the Ford Motor Company. He's got a huge job, and part of his job is as a liaison to Hollywood and product placement of Fords in movies and stuff like. And Al is a beautiful guy, very, very nice man, family guy, and he optioned the Last Call at Elaine's for a television show, and he hired a writer. And for whatever reason, I have my own. I saw the script, and I didn't think the script captured it, but I don't know anything about television, so I said, "Well, you guys know better than I." But nobody has picked it up yet. So I don't know where it's going to go.
Well, I'm not surprised that filmmakers, TV people would look at what you're writing. I mean, as we look at 5 Floors Up, it's so visual. The imagery that comes through. There are some great photographs in the center section of the book, really help kind of round out the story. But I'm kind of a contemporary here. I didn't live in New York in the age of Dinkins and Koch, but I lived 100 miles from New York, and New York's what we were aware of. And then I was in New York, and Martin was in New York when a lot of bad things were going down, when it's the Bronx is burning, and there's a social history. There's a visual kind of history of New York over the same generation. So let's talk a little bit about the book, the generations that you cover. Let's just start off. Why the title, 5 Floors Up?
So the book centers around the life and career of Chief William M. Feehan. And he was a remarkable, remarkable man. He held every rank in the fire department, from Pro-B firefighter to fire commissioner for a short period of time. He was fire commissioner during David Dinkins' administration. And when Dinkins was running for re-election against Giuliani, Mayor Rudy Giuliani again, he had beaten Giuliani the first time, just barely. So they ran again in 1993. And about a month to go before election, David Dinkins' fire commissioner quits. A man named Carlos Rivera just quit. And to make matters worse, he joined Giuliani's campaign. So not only did Dinkins not have a fire commissioner, but he had like a rat in the other camp. It was, not that Carlos Rivera was a rat. So at the time, Bill Feehan was the first deputy commissioner, which is one level down from. So after Dinkins was convinced that Chief Feehan wasn't part of the coup, he elevated him to acting commissioner. And then when he lost to Giuliani in the election, he removed the acting as a way to thank him. So at one time, Chief Feehan was the 28th fire commissioner of the city of New York. And then when Giuliani took over, he, of course, was going to put his own guy in. And somebody said, listen, you appoint whoever you want, and it would become Howard Safer, who had no experience in fire. He was a federal officer, federal law enforcement officer. They said, appoint whoever you want, but leave Bill Feehan in there to run the department, which they did. Feehan went back to his role as first deputy commissioner, and he remained that till 9/11, and he was killed in the attack. And I'll tell you about that in a bit. But he was when he was working his way up the ladder, he became a captain in a precinct in Harlem. And this was during the war years, and the war years in the fire department in the 1970s. And it was an incredibly dangerous time to be a New York City firefighter. Tom Von Essen, who was the fire commissioner during 9/11, told me that he was a firefighter in the South Bronx at the time. And he said the dispatcher used to send them to fires and tell them not to stop at fires on their way to the fire. They wouldn't allow them to stop at other fires. Make sure you go to the one you're assigned. It gives you some idea how it was. And it wasn't only the Bronx. It comes from the Bronx is burning. Most people have heard that expression, but it wasn't only the Bronx. It was Harlem. It was Lower East Side. It was parts of Brooklyn. So Bill Feehan was a new captain in a firehouse in Harlem. And the first day he shows up as a newly minted captain, he walks in and there's these salty old dog firefighters that he's going to lead sitting around the table in the firehouse completely naked. And it was this was the initiation. They wanted to see how he was going to react. So, he's a young guy, Feehan, and he just looked and he said, I think the best thing to do is not react. So he got his meal, sat and didn't say a word, went up to his office. So he passed the initiation. So, but these guys were going to so many fires, and that part of Harlem was lined with these tenement houses, 5-story tenement houses, which firefighters say is one of the most difficult fires to fight. It's tight hallways, lots of stairs, lots of windows. They're made out of wood. They're tinder boxes. So, and it always seemed to them that the fire would start at the hardest place in the building, that was on the top floor all the way into the apartment. So they had this expression, 5 floors up, 5 rooms deep. And it was their way of saying, we'll go wherever the fire takes us. And Bill Feehan, Chief Feehan, said in a taped interview I had of him, that he was convinced he was never going to get out of that firehouse alive, but he did.
Now that we understand the title of the book, can you talk us through a little bit about how it came into existence? Did it start with the families that are featured in the book, the Feehans and the Devons, or did it start with a desire to write about the fire department? So talk to us a little bit about that process.
Yeah, I was really lucky because it kind of dropped in my lap. A woman named Beth Feehan, who was the daughter-in-law of Chief William Feehan, she was in the process of making a documentary about her father-in-law. And it's an amazing film. She made it along with the filmmakers Harvey Wang and Robert Moss. And in the process of making it, she went looking for representation, and she talked to an agent and happened to be a literary agent. And the literary agent told her, Richard Abadi told her, you really should have a book. So Beth and I have mutual friends. I didn't know the Feehans and I didn't know Beth, but we have a mutual friend. And she asked this friend if he knew any writers and told him the subject. And he said, I got the perfect guy. He wrote about his family of cops. Let me introduce you. So that's how the introduction was made. But once I heard of Chief Feehan's story, and then the broader story, the historical story, the generational story, I was hooked, and I'm very grateful and very lucky. But I was lucky; it kind of fell in my lap.
How did you approach the research? How long did it take you? It's very meticulous.
So it's funny. It happened. It coincided with the pandemic here in New York, and the first months of the pandemic when it was really scary place. Outside my apartment, I heard sirens 24 hours a day, and the fire department, I was talking to Connor Davin, the youngest generation, and he was he still is a firefighter in Brooklyn, engine 231 in Brooklyn, and he was telling me about the medical calls they were going on because the EMS, they didn't have any, EMS was too busy. They couldn't go. So if you had a heart attack, the fire department was showing up, and lucky you, because all the fire department knows, if you're a firefighter, EMS and things like that. So, it gave me, first of all, it gave me a sense of being, it was a lockdown. We couldn't go out. I did all my interviews over the phone at first and things like that. But I had a lot of time and it focused me. And it also gave me a greater understanding or appreciation for the first responders as I'm hearing these sirens out there. And then they started beating the pots at 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock at night out the window. And I'd hear that out my apartment window. So, yeah, I had a lot of time, And the other thing was that the book was originally scheduled to be coincide with the 20th anniversary, but because of the pandemic, things were shuffled back, and so I had more time than I normally would have had. So yeah, I put a lot of time into building, the foundational story and the history around the story. I wanted the emphasis to be on the story, but I had plenty of time to supplement it with historical data.
Yeah, you had to match up all the things that were going on in the family with all the things going on in the world, right?
Yeah. And I like doing that. And especially the first generation was William Patrick Feehan, who he was the youngest of 10. His parents were from Mayo, and he was the only American-born child of that family. And he went into he became a firefighter. His father took off. There might have been drink involved, family secret. We don't know what was the reason between the estrangement of the father, but it makes sense. And the mother got sick. She had cancer, and William stayed, as is the wont of the youngest of an Irish American family. They stayed with mom the whole time, and until she died. And when she died, he was 34 already and single and without a career or anything, He met a girl named Catherine Cashman, whose brother was a priest and also a part-time chaplain for the FDNY. And back then, priests had, they were like union bosses. They meted out favors like a union boss, and especially. So that was William's entree into the fire department, So, but to answer your question, I mean, it was just a colorful, wonderful, amazing time and dangerous time to be a firefighter, and in the city of New York. So it matched up great, for the narrative.
Yeah, when I in reading the book and the very first Feehan, I guess William Feehan Sr. Clearly, he's a character that is totally devoted to the fire department. Now, looking at the fire department right now, I think the entry level salary when one joins the fire department somewhere in the mid $40,000, and within 5 years, I think that rises up to about $80,000. This is not a life where you get wealthy. So what struck me in the book was the kind of sense of community that firefighters share, that it's unique. It's an extraordinarily dangerous way to make a life, way to make a living, and extraordinary sacrifices sometimes paid by families. So why do you think people choose this life?
Yeah, that was the big question. And, in some sense, I'm still baffled by it. I don't know why somebody that will run into a burning building to try to save somebody they don't know. It takes a special kind of human being. And although I don't use this phrase in the book, subsequently, I've been calling it the hero gene. Some families have this gene that they pass down from generation to generation. It's also, I interviewed one retired firefighter, and I asked him to describe his time on the fire department. He told me it was more fun than grammar school, and I didn't pay attention in grammar school, he said. So, these guys, they just have fun, I mean, with Brian the other night at the reading, he was talking about that. He says, he's 33 years in, and he still smiles when he goes to work. He just loves going to work. And that's one of the reasons why it gets handed down, because the children see their parents, enjoying what they do so much, so, why the heroism part, I'm still not completely sure of why that is, to be honest with you.
It struck me in reading your book, and I'm reminded of Sebastian Junger made a documentary film called Restrepo, where they talk about that kind of band of brothers effect. And I don't think there is many other careers, where you get to develop the depth of relationship that these men and women share. They live together. They go into situations that are mortally dangerous together, which in an Irish context spins out great stories, assuming you all survive. Sometimes the stories are tragic, which also sadly has the making of a great story as well. I think these guys are just lit up in a totally different way that office drones like myself
and writers
can't really understand.
Right.
Is that fair? You think that's a reasonable explanation?
Yeah, it's I agree. I don't, like I said, I'm not completely sure what possesses a person to be able to do that. And it's as far as the band of brothers, it's a job. What other job do you bunk with the people you work with? They don't go home. They go upstairs. They all eat dinner together. They go to the supermarket together. They buy the food. They come back. They cook it together. It's such a communal thing. And around those tables in the firehouses, that's like the fires back in the Celtic times. That's where the stories begin, and the tradition is preserved and handed down, and the laughter, permeates everything. It's unique, and it's quite a thing to take a look at.
Hey guys, when you're thinking, when you're talking there, Brian, I was sort of thinking of like these professions that do kind of get passed down through generations that are. They're people who are sort of separate and apart from. There's a sort of community that people on the outside really don't understand. Now, I don't know exactly what Martin does for a living, and he doesn't know exactly what I do for a living, but, we sit in front of computers all day long, that sort of thing. But, I was thinking, the flying Walendas, tightrope walkers. I used to work in horse racing, and that was a father to son to daughter kind of occupation. And one thing, when I worked in horse racing, I worked in the sort of press media aspect. It was a world with its own language, and we'd have sports writers come in to cover the Belmont Stakes, and they were top sports writers in baseball and football. When they got to horse racing, you could sort of read their articles and you knew they didn't quite have it as the way a racing writer would, just something off. It was accurate. It was true, but it was just not quite right. And I think I was so amazed with what you were writing about all the sort of the detail of firefighting, the names of the tools, the slang and lingo they use. To me, it read perfectly true. How'd you grab all that great detail? Because I don't know the detail myself, but it sounded so real.
So I let firefighters read it, and especially Brian Davin. I let, he's in the book, and I let him read it. He not only read his parts, but other parts to make sure I was doing it right, because I got him wrong. They call the schedule, I think the police department calls it tours or something, and they call it chart. and I had it the wrong way. I had it, he say, oh, no, you got to take that out. You got to call it chart. They'll know right away. You don't know what you're talking about. So yeah, I had help, and I think that's what a writer does. You got to have help. You're not going to know it. You're not going to know the language. And after a while, you get talking to them. You pick things up that will resonate. There'll be words and expressions that will resonate and make it more authentic. So I think that's how I did it.
Yeah, it goes along with all the other great detail throughout the book about the city of New York, how it was changing. You also start with the very earliest days of firefighting in New York, and you touch on something two other of our guests have touched on, Peter Quinn and Larry Kerwin, the draft riots in New York, and when New York's fire department there wasn't a fire department. It was a pretty haphazard affair of volunteers. Maybe just we want to spend more time on kind of the later stages of Five Floors Up. But how about the origins of the fire department and why is it so Irish?
Well, I don't know I do mention the draft riots, and I do cover briefly that era of the fire department. But I'll tell you in my own experience, I went to Greenwood Cemetery once. I co-wrote a book with Malachi McCourt. Actually, I helped him write the book called Death Need Not Be Fatal. And one of the readings we had was in the caretaker's cottage in the middle of Greenwood Cemetery. It was just great. And it was at night in the fall. It was like I was waiting for ghosts. But on the way in there, I passed Boss Tweed's grave, and the word was that he was, he was grafted up to his neck. And for those who might not know, Boss Tweed was led Tammany Hall, but he also ran his own fire company, and one of those volunteer companies. And the word was he went to jail. The word was that they took all his money. He had no money. He has the biggest memorial in Greenwood Cemetery. It's it's bigger than, it's enormous. So he must have died with something. But it was a very colorful time. And, Daniel Day-Lewis movie. I'm forgetting the name of it. Gangs of New York covers that time too. I think one of the ways I got some of the information is on the at the fire department's academy on Randall's Island here in New York. There's a whole amazing school and training facility for firefighters, new firefighters and firefighters learning other aspects of firefighting. And there's a library there called the Manned Library. And the Manned Library has captain's logs going back to the 1830s. And they have, these old photographs that are, and unfortunately, a lot of the stuff is falling, literally disintegrating because of the paper it was printed on. You have to preserve it. And it's very expensive. There's a whole political thing going on to try to get the money to preserve this stuff. But, I was in there, and, you have to wear the gloves and you have to have somebody with you. You open these binders up of these volunteer companies. It was incredible. And, I love that part of research. I love when so much is done on the computer today, and the computer is amazing. The internet, you could find anything, but there's still nothing matches the physical, the tactile experience of picking up an old book and seeing somebody's handwriting that was written back in 1835 or something like that. So it was really an interesting experience for me.
From the past, I'd just like to flash forward to September 11, 2001, which, of course, today is also September 11th, 21 years later. I was in New York on that day. And I think, like many New Yorkers, it's a day, sadly, we will never forget. And of course, in your book, the main character, William Feehan Jr., or Bill Feehan, I think as you refer to him in the book, is the deputy fire commissioner when September 11th takes place. like John, I don't like to think too much about September 11. I think we all carry a certain survivor guilt, might be a little bit too over the top, but it was an ugly day that many of us, would prefer to forget. Now, of course, in preparation for this interview, I wasn't afforded that privilege to forget.
Sorry about that.
And I have to say that your writing of Bill Feehan's experience as you understand it on that day was actually some of the more gripping prose that I've read in the past decade. In a visceral sense, I kind of got a sense of the concussive effects of collapse, of bodies falling out of windows. It was just gripping to read. And then you kind of wonder about the decisions that he made that day, because he, I believe he was out in that famous firefighter enclave out on the end of the Rockaways, Breezy Point, when he realized what was happening. Can you just take us through a little bit of that? 9/11 as seen, as you understand it, by Bill Feehan.
Actually, Chief Feehan was in the Rockaways, Breezy Point that morning, and it is an Irish enclave it's one of the most beautiful places anywhere. But in New York City, it's almost like you're in a different planet. It's at the tip of the Rockaway Peninsula in the Atlantic Ocean. It's gorgeous beaches, and you can see the whole skyline. You can see the World Trade Center. You can see Coney Island and the big wheel and the fair and the roller coaster. And it's an incredible place. But he had gone into work that morning. So he was actually in fire department headquarters in Brooklyn. And he was in his office, and his plan was to meet an old friend, his aide, who had retired a couple of months before, for lunch. He was looking forward to it, and somebody yelled down the hall, a plane had hit. So some people at headquarters said that the windows actually bowed when American Airlines Flight 11 hit the tower, however many seconds it took for the shock wave to make its way to 13 miles to Brooklyn, that it actually bowed the windows. Once they saw, somebody said it was a small plane. You hear that a lot, but one of the chiefs was there, Tom Fitzpatrick, and he took a look at it. He said, "No, look at the size of the hole. That's commercial. That's a commercial airliner." So they got in the cars and they raced to New York, and they got to the Trade Center when just before, as they're getting out of the car, the second airliner hits the South Tower, and pieces of the airplane, of the fuselage, body parts start to rain down on them, and they make their way to the North Tower lobby where the command center was. A fire department had set up the command center, which was protocol for high-rise fires. You're supposed to set up the command center in the lobby because you're going to be sending fire units upstairs and things like that. You have to take care of it. But for the Trade Center, it was not optimum because they had no idea what was going on. All the communications were out. They had no idea what was going on 80 floors above and 90 floors above. In fact, when the South Tower was hit, a lot of the chiefs in the North Tower didn't even know the South Tower had been hit. That's how isolated it was. So Chief Feehan and a couple other of his higher echelon fire department officials went out looking for a secondary command post. And the way the Trade Center was set, it runs West Street, kind of runs on the Hudson River side of the Trade Center, and there was a walk bridge that went over it. There were two, actually. And they went over to the walk bridge, and the other side of the West Street is the World Financial Center. And they found what they thought would be a perfect setup in the loading dock of the American Express building, which for the first time, Chief Feehan and Chief Gansey, who was the chief of the department at the time, was with him. They could see the whole vista of the World Trade Center. What they saw was shocking. They didn't, between them, they had like 70 years of fire department experience, and nothing came close. And one of the chiefs saw on the South Tower, saw the top rings of the tower start to twinkle like Christmas lights, is how he explained it. And what that was actually were the windows pulverizing as the top floors collapsed. And as they came down, this hurricane, of debris, of heavy material in the air came blowing out them, and they ran for their lives. All of them ran into the down the loading dock and into the American Express building. Chief Feehan was able to find a way to get out. A lot of them they got lost in the labyrinth of the buildings, and they couldn't come out back to the loading dock. But Chief Feehan came out, and so did Gansey, and so did a chief named Ray Downey. And when the South Tower came down, it severely damaged the Marriott Hotel, which was attached to the tower. And inside the Marriott were firefighters that were on their way up to be sent up the South Tower. And so Chief Feehan and Chief Gansey were orchestrating a rescue of the firefighters caught in the Marriott Hotel. And in the book, I say his face felt the heat of 1,000 fires, and maybe that's a little bit of an exaggeration. But Bill Feehan worked in a lot of busy firehouses on his way up. So if it's a stretch, it's not a big stretch. And here he was at 71, the oldest member of the fire department, facing the biggest fire the fire department ever faced. And as he was orchestrating that rescue, the North Tower came down and killed him and Chief Gansey and Chief Ray Downey, three of the monuments of the fire department. And I have his son Billy, who was not a firefighter. I wrote in the beginning of the book. I described that, but I also described the day after, and his son Billy wanted to go to Ground Zero. And if you want, I'll read a little bit of that.
Please.
Billy had asked his father's aide, the fellow who had retired a couple of months before 9/11, to take him to. He wanted to see where his father had died, and they made their way through. I mean, it was not only an active fire scene; geysers of fire are blowing up through the pile, and things are shifting. Girders. It was very dangerous, but they were able to. And it was also filled with firefighters looking for their brethren, people, first responders, searching. It was an active search scene. It was an active fire scene, and it was an active crime scene. So they made their way through this end of the world apocalyptic scene, and they got to West Street and approximately where Bill Feehan was caused by the North Tower. And this is what I write. Standing on the spot where terrorists murdered his dad, Billy felt nothing for those who killed him. Homicide is the cause of death listed on his father's death certificate, the first issued to a member of the FDNY killed in the attack. There would be anger, plenty, but not at that moment. Instead, he felt strangely comfortable, as though time had stood still and his father's last breath still hung in the air. Later, Billy would tell people he could have stayed there all night and the night after. At that moment, alone in this shattered and holy place, he had found the answer to the question that had burned in his mind. His father had died as he would have wanted, wearing his helmet, his gear, and a jacket that bore the initials of an organization to which he had long since given his life, the FDNY. At some point, as he stood in the wreckage, time began to move forward for Billy, for the rest of America, too. Soon, Billy's melancholy was replaced with a hollow ache and the growing awareness that he would never have his dad again. The family held a funeral the following Sunday at St. Mel's in Flushing, the Feehan's parish. Chief Feehan was the first of 3 high-profile FDNY funerals that day. Later, masses would be said for Pete Gansey and Father Michael Judge, the beloved department chaplain. At first, a relatively small group of firefighters gathered to pay their last respects outside the church. In normal times, there would have been a sea of firefighters dressed in Class A blue and white gloves for a line of duty death. But those members who weren't working were digging through the smoking pile, still searching, still holding on to a fading hope. As fire officers in white hats and Class A's carried out Bill's coffin, draped with the FDNY red and white flag, a single violinist played a Shokin farewell. Billy had first heard the musician play the tune a few weeks before in the World Trade Center's concourse. He'd come out of the PATH train and was headed towards his office in the Woolworth building. The sweet sadness of the song reminded him of his dad. He dropped a few bucks in the open violin case and took the violinist's card. Weeks before the attack on the World Trade Center and his father's death, he had no reason to hire a violinist. But now, as the melody accompanied his dad's casket into the bright sunshine, the moment seemed faded. Outside the church, the crowd had grown into the hundreds. The firefighters didn't wear a Class A dress uniform, but instead bunker gear that was covered in cement dust from the World Trade Center. They had come from the pile to pay their respects to a man most of them knew by reputation only. Chief Feehan was a boss, a big boss, and by rank about as far removed from the firehouse as you could get. But even when he held the lofty post of fire commissioner, he insisted on being called chief, an homage to the uniform that bound him to the firefighters who now stood in silence and saluted his coffin.
You quote from the New York Times in the aftermath of 9/11 that 4,400 collective years of firefighting died when the Twin Towers came down.
Yeah. And it's funny, a captain named Ray Goldback, who worked with Chief Feehan at headquarters, said the one guy, after the attack, he said the one guy that could put this back together again died in the attack, Bill Feehan. But they would put it together again. You know, Tom Van Essen and the rest of the higher echelon of the department. And they filled the wound, you know, although they still carry the wound. You know, I interviewed Tom Van Essen in the new tower, the new World Trade Center tower. He took a job with FEMA in the World Trade Center. And here's a guy that oversaw a department that lost 343 of his members in an office that overlooks the memorial pools of the World Trade Center attack. And I asked him, I said, how could you do this? And, you know, you could tell by the way he sat, by the way he talked, by the way he looked, that he still carried this huge weight on his shoulders. And he said something to the effect of, you know, I took the job. At first I wasn't going to do it, but there was something about being close to them, you know, that although it wasn't the only reason, it was one of the reasons that he decided to take the job with FEMA. And I think he's retired from FEMA now too. He's on to retirement life. A wonderful, wonderful man, Tom Van Essen.
I could explore the depth of this story a lot more on September 11th. I do remember the period directly afterwards where it just seemed like on the way to work, I'd encounter a funeral, and these funerals went on. And as you mentioned, 343 of New York's bravest died in that one day. It was a pain, I think, that was certainly felt by all New Yorkers. I can't imagine for the collective families what that has to be like, and the scar that's still there. It will never go. And I think you do great justice to it in the book. So I thank you for writing that. But unfortunately, we're getting to that point in the podcast where we have to wrap things up, and we call, on a more lighthearted way, this point of the podcast, the shameless plug, which is your opportunity to tell us about a cause or something that is dear to your heart at the moment. So I will turn over shameless plug to you.
Oh, geez, you put me on the spot. Now it's going to be a shameless promotion. 5 Floors Up is available on Amazon and in bookstores near you. I'm out pushing the book, and I'm on to something else. I've written about cops, and I've written about firefighters, and all that's left is sanitation workers. So maybe that's my next job.
It's just want to mention about this book because it doesn't end tragically, but there's a tragic moment that the whole book sort of, leads up to. But this is not just a book for, if you're interested in Irish Americanness or if you're a fire buff. It's the history of the city as it plays out around this one Irish American family over the generations. It's a portrait of a growing city with shifting demographics, changes in lifestyle, cultural mores, political upheaval, technological advances. Through it all, the timeless values endure. Thank you so much, Brian.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Martin. It was fun.
Well, Martin, let's recap what we just heard with Brian.
Yeah, but before we do that, we're going to do our call to action. And for listeners, do you know that we actually have a website, unlike many podcasts? I recommend you go on there. There's a blog, and all our episodes are listed there, and you can filter them by content and location. So to go to our website, it is irishstewpodcast.com. All one word, irishstewpodcast.com. So check it out and find something else to listen to besides this wonderful episode.
Easy to remember that address. Brian I really enjoyed speaking with him. He's a really accomplished writer. He's written quite a string of books, and he does some co-writing and ghostwriting as well. I got to get Last Call at Elaine's, a journey from one side of the bar to the other for kind of a lighter note. And he's written some very serious books as well, including 5 Floors Up, which we talked to him here on 9/11.
Yeah, really moving stuff, kind of right in my wheelhouse, this combination of history, but also a family story and a story about the city. There's a lot of strength to this kind of writing because it's so accessible. And before you know it, you've learned a whole bunch of things that you really didn't understand. And of course, today is September 11th, and we're mindful of all those families that lost a loved one, be it in the fire department or people that just went to work on that day. So I think Brian does great credit to the memory of all those that we lost that day. And I strongly recommend you go out and get yourself a copy of 5 Floors Up. It's published by Grand Central Publishing. It's a great read, and I think it gives everybody a better understanding of New York's bravest and obviously that tragic day, September 11th. Irish Stew is produced by John Lee, Martin Nutty, and Bill Schultz. Editing, mixing, and mastering by Bill Schultz. Music on Irish Stew was composed and performed by Rosa Nutty, with Donald Bowens on drums, Cathal O'Riordan on bass and synthesizer. For more on Rosa Nutty's music, please visit rosanutty.com.